Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Georgia Christa, Tax Event Coordinator, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you today Jonathan Weatherill to present his talk, New Vernacular Architecture, Creating Identity of Place, Research and Practice. Jonathan is an associate professor in Rome program of the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. He's a practicing architect who has lived in Italy since graduating from the Architectural Association in London over 25 years ago. He runs his own practice and has also collaborated with Pier Carlo Bontempi since they met in Milan 30 years ago. His professional experience has spanned the genre of modernism and classicism in a wide range of fields, from industrial design to restoration and urban planning. Those being said, I would like to hand over to Jonathan now, so he can start his presentation. But after I will let you know that after the talk, we will have a session of question and answers. If you have questions during the talk, please type them on the bottom bar of the screen. And after the talk, I will ask you to unmute your microphone and ask directly your questions. I think that would be the best. So now I let Jonathan start. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Georgia. I will give a brief introduction to myself and then an explanation and illustration of damage done to the environment by architects in the last century, which has, caused and provoked me to take the direction in architecture which I have taken. It's quite a complex process. And then I will illustrate a project that I am working on and how it was necessary for me to investigate the mechanisms behind vernacular architecture to create an identity for this place which I'm working in. So let me, as Georgia has already mentioned, I went to this place as an architecture student. So it's very, very different environment from what people in the traditional architecture group, I think, are used to. This is the sort of thing, they put in front of their school in Bedford Square in London. And my heroes, of course, were the usual suspects of the time, including ex-students who I actually mounted an exhibition with in the Architectural Association. These were my models for architecture. I was, as a teenager, I was enamored with James Sterling, Rogers, Piano, Foster, and I was convinced I wanted to be an archistar myself. I lived just up the road in London, in Hampstead, from Michael Hopkins's house, and I still appreciate to some extent the sort of classical modernism of Mies, although how unsustainable it is, we know, and also the greats of the 20th century. And like many architects, and I'll mention this later, I was very much enamored of the aesthetic of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, although I did realize that it wasn't a model, it was a warning. More of that later. This is my thesis project, just to give you an idea of where I was when I was a student. More of my thesis project. I won't explain what it was. You can ask at the end. But in the meantime, while I'm doing this, I'm working at the Architectural Association, studying at the Architectural Association. I'm working in my summer holidays in Italy, having met, as Georgia mentioned, Pier Carlo Bontempi in the late 80s, when he wasn't a traditional architect. And together with Pier Carlo Bontempi, we went back to his hometown near Parma, and we built the first new traditional buildings in Italy to all intents and purposes. And many of them won numerous awards. So this is my summer holiday activity while I'm at the Architectural Association is this. Some of this is later, after I graduated, I went back and worked with Pier Carlo Bontempi, and never really considered it to be my vocation to design architects like this. although I did appreciate the value of it, and I appreciated what I learned from understanding how to design it properly and make environments that really do look like they've been there for hundreds of years, and houses and villas. A turning point was when we won the second prize, not the first prize, for the Marsham Street competition, which some of you may remember. And that led to further developments and work and more prize-winning schemes in small towns and neighborhoods. But this was the architecture that the modernists had promoted. And working with Piercarlo Bontempi and discussing things, I did realize that modern architects could have had and did have detrimental effect on the environment, on the open environment. We know Le Corbusier's Plan Rozzano for Paris, which would have raised the center of the whole city to the ground and replaced it with huge skyscrapers. This is a rendering of what it could have looked like. Le Corbusier wasn't the only one to have crazy ideas. They had them in England as well. This was a scheme by Arup and Wills, and I don't remember the name, but English architects of the time in the 1950s, to solve the problem they saw as people moving out of the center of London and trying to attract them. This was their scheme to try to attract people back to Soho. So you have Piccadilly Circus at the bottom. You can recognize Regent Street bending around to the left, and they've got a good bit of facadism there. Just kept the facade up and built behind it, and then Shaftesbury Avenue off to the right. This fortunately didn't get built. This also fortunately didn't get built. This is the London County Council scheme to the urban regeneration of Covent Garden. Let's call it that. Call it urban regeneration. You can see the Royal Opera House there and the market of Covent Garden englobed within this mass of overpasses and brutalist tower blocks. Of course, they did manage to do that in Birmingham, which you know very well. So Birmingham, as the secondary city in England, was deemed a suitable proving ground to sacrifice to the experimentation of post-war urbanism in architecture. The Central Library of Birmingham is a well-known and well-hated building, which was inspired by one of America's most hated buildings, which is the Boston City Hall. So, I mean, and architects in America, even famous architects, did iconic buildings such as this, is the Bell Labs headquarters in Holmdel, New Jersey. I'm just talking about this briefly as an example of one of the many examples of where architects fall down with small details. This was where my grandmother actually worked. She was a private secretary of the president of Bell Labs, and she moved into this building when it was first built. When it was first built, it had a mirror glass facade, and the janitors, the maintenance crew, would have to go around the building every morning and sweep up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dead birds, because this is in the middle of greenery. So in this photo, you can see they actually changed the mirror glass to black mirror glass, so the birds didn't bump into it. You'll see why. This is a iconic photograph of it from the ground at the time when it was black. You'll see more of that later again. Of course, then in England and throughout the world, people did realize that the modern experimentation had not been very successful. Moves were made to remove these buildings from the earth, and a lot of them were removed. But the errors persisted, and architects continued to repeat the same errors. And as I mentioned about Blade Runner became literally an inspiration for urbanists, modern urbanists in the city now to this day. Obviously, Ridley Scott intended this movie to be a dystopic warning of what the world could become. And that's what the world has become. It is becoming in the city environment. You have Shanghai, but not only the Chinese and the Arabs are to blame, but London is, as you know, being scarred by buildings which are much, much taller than St. Paul's, and really should never have been there. The famous walkie-talkie building is something you just can't avoid seeing if you walk around the city. I mean, you need a pair of glasses that sort of blacks it out. The only way you can not see it is to go up inside it. Throughout the world, of course, architects have tried to make their mark on the countryside, on the landscape, on the city, in the provocative or inspiring or uninspiring ways. This is Mario Botta's Casino for Campione d'Italia in northern Italy. Actually, it's an Italian enclave in Switzerland. It's on the Lake Lugano, and as you see, it looks like a nuclear power station. And this is seen from the other side. It actually blocks out the sun for half the town. And was voted #1 eco monster in Lombardy several years running. You don't need to. I don't really need to explain why these buildings are quite so offensive to me. I mean, these, as a almost convinced modernist, I began to see these things and work with modern architects and understand, the mistakes they made. These are the most iconic ones. Liebeskin's various museums, which are supposed to be expressions of violence, but an expression of violence is fine in a sculptural work of art, but in a building is a little bit over the top, in my opinion. Excuse the elegant bottle I'm drinking out, I'm sorry. Rem Koolhaas's concert hall, Zaha Hadid's Antwerp Port Authority building. You can sort of interpret what's happening to that poor historic building underneath it, I would say. In Rome, we have Massimiliano Fuxas's famous cloud. The cloud was a dream of Archistar's since time began. The architect wanted to build a cloud or create a cloud-shaped building. So Massimiliano Fuxas built this conference center in Rome, which I think cost something like 2 billion euros. And the conference hall, which is in the cloud, houses about 50 people and is completely unusable because of the acoustics. So it's used for book fairs at best. Church architecture in the modern age is, another problematic aspect. The ones on the left are bunkers, the ones on the right are churches. Oh, no, sorry, it's the other way around. And even recently, we have just escaped a few returns to sort of arrogance and overpowering sort of will of modern architects. Marks and Spencer's building on Oxford Street it's not the most outstanding building in London, but it is a building which is of its place. But they wanted to build a building which was of its time. And as we know, time passes and place remains. So fortunately, Michael Gove, who I have never really had a great admiration for, I do appreciate very much that he blocked this building. No matter how much Marks and Spencer's think it's a lost opportunity for Oxford Street, I think it's a gained piece of relief that it's not being built. Back to Holmdel and Eero Saarinen's Bell Labs building. This is what it ended up being converted into this with the black glass after he died. It was finished after he died. And now it's been restored. And the actually architect friend of mine, Alexander Gorlin in New York, has had the great idea of replacing the original mirror glass on the building. So we will see what the birds think of that. In urban design, the folly that mankind can reach is almost uncalculable. This Adolfo Natalini was actually one of Piercarlo Bontempi's professors in Florence University. And as part of the group Super Studio, he designed this series of very provocative mega scale urban interventions called Continuous Monument, which many of you I'm sure know. The purpose of this was similar to the purpose of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, it was really an admonition, a warning of what could happen, you know, if mankind sort of got out of control and his ego grew too much. And guess what? You know, they're actually building it. And obviously, it's a great idea to build a 100-mile-long mirror in the middle of a desert along the seaside. I'm sure the birds will love this one as well. But I mean, it's almost as meaningful, I think, as you know, this kind of idea here. This is another great idea an architect came up with. It really, it's obviously not serious, it's not realistic, but it's a proposal that was, you know, published on Design and in the architecture establishment as a visionary idea of having a, you know, I don't know how long it is, 50-mile-long skyscraper hanging from an asteroid and dangling over New York. Of course, the asteroid would be going around the Earth at 5 times the speed of sound, probably. So I'm not quite sure how that would work. But this is the sort of it's emblematic, I would say, and illustrates how in touch a lot of the architecture establishment is with real world reality. But the real problem that I see is not the iconic provocative building, not the Libeskind Museum or the Zaha Hadid Airport. The real problem that we have to deal with every day is this, and it's the everyday environment. It's the suburbs. It's what you know occupies the rest of the world, what normal people actually have to live in. This is what actually really impacts the quality of our life and the quality of the environment we live in. It's not the one scary building or the one beautiful theater that makes a difference to our world. It's all the rest. It's all the mediocrity that we have to live with every day. And so this is really where I began to feel that I could make a difference. I mean, starting at the edge with low key architecture, everyday architecture, which fills in all the space that we live in. These are just images that you pick up if you look for, you know, do a Google search for suburbs in Europe. This is, you know, typical Italian suburb. More of the same. And it's not places. These aren't places. These are, as you know, they're non-places. And I hope I'm preaching to the converted here. This is what you see from Catania Airport. In Catania, the central of the city of Catania is a beautiful town, obviously. But like every other city in the world, this is what surrounds it. You know, architects obviously have had a great part in this. We have the Fiorentini's Corviale, which is a 1 kilometer long ground scraper outside Rome, which is still hailed by the architectural establishment, by the students and professors of architecture in schools worldwide as an example of visionary social housing. In Scampia, you have the so-called sales, the vele, one of which are all actually being demolished now, except for one, which is being kept as a kind of warning monument. And we have the work of esteemed colleague and sadly missed, I'm sorry to say that he died during COVID, Vittorio Grigotti, who was very, very proud of his Zen quarter in Palermo. This is a social housing project that Vittorio Grigotti designed for the outskirts of Palermo. Zen has nothing to do with Far Eastern philosophy. It just means, it's an acronym for Zona Espansione Nord, which means North Expansion Zone. That's a very romantic name. And Vittorio Grigotti was very, very proud of this and just, you know, insisted that it was misunderstood. He was a proponent of democratic architecture. Architecture should be the same for all, whether they are nobility or proletarians. And of course, Grigotti himself lived in a beautiful palace in the center of Milan. And a television interviewer once asked him, you know, so if you believe in democratic architecture and the proletariat and the nobility should all live in the same environment, why don't you go and live in the Zen quarter in Palermo? And the Grigotti replied to him, don't be silly, I'm not a proletarian. So the philosophy of modernist architects as democrats was very clearly just words rather than actions. But the same principles of design and urbanism can be applied to low-cost social housing as they can to high-cost luxury housing. If you take the same architecture by the same architect and just plow loads and loads of money and landscaping into it, it will survive. It won't be a dystopic environment, but I wouldn't say it's the ideal environment. This is the Gregotti's Bicocca quarter in Milan. And there's literally no services. I mean, there maybe is a cafe on the corner, but there are no shops and no supermarkets. That's the theory of modern urbanism. You separate where you live from where you work, from where you go shopping. And all the people in the Bicocca district, north of Milan, go here to go shopping. And it's very romantically called Bicocca Village. And of course, it's a mall, although it's called a village. So the use of terminology is very, very insidious. Sustainability, resilience, social, village. Another one is this one that I visited recently. This is to the west of Milan. Cascina Merlata means crenellated farm, and it's green, and it's got these lollipop trees and people on bicycles holding hands, and it's so wonderful. And this is what it looks like. And believe me, the photograph does it a great favor. It's much, much worse in real life. Anyway, so the problem of the suburbs, of all the rest of the environment, it's a worldwide problem. I mean, if you go to different parts of the world, the problem exists in different forms, but this is really, to my mind, where the issues are in the sprawl. And the reason for this has been, the American model was born of the fact that gasoline costs nothing. It's cheap, space was cheap, fuel was cheap, so no one could think twice about driving everywhere. And even historic towns such as Parma in Italy are not immune from this. I mean, center of Parma is one of the most beautiful complexes in Italy, with this the Duomo, the baptistry, and then behind the Duomo there's another church of San Giovanni. It's idyllic little town along the Via Emilia. The central street, which you see down here on the left, is the Roman road of the Via Emilia that runs from Milan all the way down to Ancona on the coast of the Adriatic. This is a historic postcard, of course, but today it looks pretty similar. But if you take the same road and just drive 10 minutes out of the city center of Parma, this is where you are. You're in America. You've got, McDonald's and large-scale retail. It's the same. The problem has reappeared even here and is endemic to the whole of Europe. The figure ground, sort of empty, road-intensive, infrastructure-intensive urbanism has really created a very difficult environment for us to live in. This was just a comparison of a Midwestern American town. This is Grand Bahama in the Caribbean, which is planned on the same model, as you can see, and the same scale. These are both of the same scale. The block sizes, the roads, all the same scale. And then, of course, all the cars have to go somewhere. This is a strip mall, and the amount of parking, the space, the surface, it's just breathtakingly brutal. This is Grape Road in Mishawaka, which is the town next to South Bend, which is where Notre Dame's main campus is in America. I had the pleasure of staying there for 5 months in 2020. So I got to understand a little bit more about American urbanism, although I know it's not the first time I've been to America, of course. But there is the modern response to let's talk about architecture. Modern response to the architecture of the suburbs, or architecture in general, residential architecture, is this. These are more reasons for me turning away from my vocation as an Archistar from the Architectural Association. This is just another random Google search of modern house. Put the words modern house in, and this is what you get. They're all very, very similar, very, very homologated. boxes in white and gray. And you really couldn't tell who designed which one. They're all very, very similar. I'll just go through this briefly, but it's a malaise, which is I've noticed in other fields. One of the fields that I've noticed it in was office architecture, office design, office furniture. All are terribly badly designed and very, very dull and boring and very, very similar. The only really interesting office furniture is the actually traditional office furniture. So boxes for people to work in. Another one which I love to hate are RVs, caravans. Why is it that all caravans look the same? It's the same. I'm just comparing these to architecture because if you look at caravans and you think, why are they all so ugly? You can ask exactly the same about modern architecture. Funnily enough, the nicer ones are the older ones. Expensive boats again. Where's the difference? You spend hundreds of millions of dollars on these things and they look just like everyone else's. But if you look at, a random search for traditional Italian house, here we are. Suddenly seems to become more interesting, strangely enough. Classical house. Again, here we are, Design's top 10 houses of all the various years. Funnily enough, they all look very, very, very similar and very, very, very boring. I think you got the point, so I won't labor it any much further. Back to the iconic great people. I mean, and the other interesting and sort of humorous thing to notice is that they are all very similar amongst themselves as well. I mean, there's a sort of common trait in the eyewear. And so whilst I greatly admire and always have admired monumental, strong and assertive classical architecture, such as Ledoux's Barrière de la Villette in Paris, and Blenheim Palace, which is literally a theater set. I have to say that actually what I find more interesting when I visit stately home, for example, is the agricultural courtyard. The stable blocks, the more lowly, functional, and let's say slightly closer to the vernacular kind of portions of those houses. So vernacular and just with the background architecture that you find throughout the countryside in various places is really what attracts my attention, because it is the same architecture that is built in the suburbs nowadays, but it's what was done 200 years ago. So I find it extremely interesting to look at simple rural, semi-rural, urban architecture and understand how that can be used as a tool to design in a more pleasant and interesting way in the present day. This is actually a slaughterhouse in Spoleta, but it's a very, very beautiful building by the same architect who designed the Sferisterio of Macerata. If anyone knows that, you can look it up. So, I mean, this is a very quick sketch project I did for a hotel on the lakeside south of Milan. So I'm using those rural models to design new architecture, and it's somehow much more satisfying. Modern architects criticize traditional architects, and they always have criticized traditional architects for copying the past. And I would say they should try it. It's not that easy, and you don't actually copy the past. What you do is you look at the past and you learn from it. Whereas modern architects I've actually worked with, and I have witnessed the fact that they literally do copy each other. So if I do have to copy something, I'd like to copy something which is 200 or 300 years old rather than copying my colleagues. So here to the case in point, that was just a sort of background of why I'm doing what I will show you now. the project I'm working on at the moment, I've been working on for a couple of years now, and it's in a transitory moment, and will pick up again at the beginning of next year. It's this little pin on the map. It's a town south of Milan called Rozzano. Milan is, of course, the main city in northern Italy. And Rozzano is right on the south border of the city. The south of Milan is a green belt, because the land around the south in the Po Valley is very, very fertile. And so it hasn't been developed. Whereas the land to the north of Milan is not so fertile. So it's been was converted in the 19th century with the unification of Italy, started to be converted to industrial use. And it is now more or less built up from Milan to Switzerland. This was Rozzano about 100 years ago. It was a tiny farming village. You can see a large farm in the background there, and the small sort of gaggle of houses. The rest was all countryside. This is what it looks like now. This is a figure ground plan of the city, really city of Rozzano. It's now over 40,000 inhabitants. And from 1960 to 1980, let's say mid-60s to mid-70s, it grew from 3,000 inhabitants to 30,000 inhabitants. And the reason for this was that it was developed to house immigrants from southern Italy. So it was a dormitory town which was built in the space of 10 years. 27,000 of those inhabitants were all in social housing. And the model which is used to build Rozzano in the 60s and 70s was literally Soviet suburban development, because that was the political leaning at the time, and it was the ideology at the time. So you have prefabricated modular concrete tower blocks, spaced wide apart. And I won't tell you which one of these are actually Soviet houses and which ones of these are actually in Rozzano. The only way you can actually tell is to look at the road signs or the number plates of the cars. But this is what Rozzano looks like now. This is actually right next to one of my sites. So what we have is a very good example of what I would say the sort of sick suburban development that was rife in the 60s and 70s throughout the world, and is now needs attention. This is what it looks like now. These are photographs I've taken in the town a couple of years ago. This is the main road of Rozzano, same main road, big tower blocks and very, very poorly constructed, low-rise commercial areas, very, very little commercial space of this sort of quality. Mentioning to the town council why there isn't more mixed-use commercial areas within the town. They say, oh, we tried neighborhood retail, and this is an example of the neighborhood retail they tried, but it didn't work. Funnily enough, it is just soul-destroying to look at. So the people of Rozzano, to go shopping, go here, of course, like they do in the Bicocca area. They take their cars and they go 5 miles out to a huge shopping mall with an American-style parking lot. The area around Rozzano is also filled with similar examples of urbanism. These are high-level luxury developments. This is actually called Milano 3, third Milan, Milano 2 and Milano 3, Milan 2 and Milan 3 were Silvio Berlusconi's cash cows. They were the developments that Silvio Berlusconi developed and made a huge amount of money out of. They're very, very well landscaped, very expensively maintained. So like Grigotti's Bicocca district, they are high maintenance, high cost luxury developments in an otherwise dystopic urban environment. Again, south of Milan, in the middle of the countryside, you have the Ripamonti residence, which is this huge hemicycle hotel and residence and office center in the middle of the countryside. So back to Rozzano, what happened is that the town council realized that their urban fabric had basically reached the end of its life. The tower blocks, as we know, reinforced concrete has a lifespan now of about 50 to 60 years. And they now need extensive refurbishment and renovation. And the fact is that when the town of Rozzano was built in the 60s and 70s, the buildings were built of very low quality. It was built in an area infested by mosquitoes. No one wanted to live in it except the people that didn't have a choice. So you had a social disadvantaged category of people from the very start. And the architecture of the city has actually created a very, very bad social condition. So the administrators of the town have actually come to the realization that they don't want to refurbish these buildings. They want to knock them down. And gradually knocking them down, they want to replace them with actual real open fabric. And they approached us, they approached actually the office of Piercarlo Bontempi, who I still do work with on occasion, and asked us to do 2 model neighborhoods as examples of what Rozzano would become in the future. And I was in charge with these projects because I know the area well. I've worked in the area extensively on my own for the past 20 years, and I've documented it very, very extensively. So the 2 sites that the town council gave us were disused sports fields. This is the northernmost site, and here on the north you see the ring road around the south of Milan. You see the big concrete tower blocks on the right, and the school, which I showed, you may have seen in one of the photographs previously. And we have about 10 acres of disused sports ground to play with. It's flanked on the north by a green swathe of public parkland, which protects it from the highway, which is raised up and has a barrier. And on the south, it borders the center of the city, center of the town. The southernmost site was a similar disused sports ground, similar size, about 10 acres. And again, it flanks a very small public park with some streams and rivers running through it. On the left, what you have is the Naviglio Pavese, the canal which runs out of Milan to Pavia to the south, which was a navigable canal. It isn't anymore, but it could be again. Was before the advent of trains, water was the way that things were transported throughout Italy. And the Cathedral of Milan was built with marble that was transported up this canal. This is the sort of countryside around it at the moment. This is the northernmost site. This is the green park to the north of the football fields. This is the road to the south. This is the southernmost site. So not exactly the most inspiring environment to work in. Very challenging indeed. So I started with a very simple analysis of the site, a figure ground plan. Public greenery is dark, private greenery is light. To distill the basic elements that I had to work with. And I did a very quick comparison study of the size of the site. I won't labor you too much with the description of the open design of this, because I want to get into the actual architecture aspects. But overlaying a 10-acre site onto a historic city, you can find that you can get most of a small medieval town in that site. Not that we would actually want to, because that would be very, very high density in such a rural environment. But it's an interesting comparison. You don't need me to tell you what this is, I hope, but it's Pienza anyway, in Tuscany. So I did this comparison with various cities. This is the figure ground of Pienza, the other way up. Picture of Pienza. So this is the kind of environment you have in that small 10-acre area. Here we have almost an ideal Renaissance town of Sabbioneta near Mantua. Like most ideal towns, it's not actually that successful, although it is a very, very beautiful star in Bertolucci's spider strategy. If you want to go and see some interesting northern Italian Po Valley architecture, watch Bertolucci's spider strategy, and any film over 50 years old you can download from archive.org. So I'm sorry. Interesting, just things to look at. This is a town along the canal out of Milan to the west. This is called Gargiano. So here we are, I'm getting a little bit closer to the environment where I'm actually working. So this is a small rural town along a canal. The wide swathe, of course, is the canal in the figure ground diagram. And it's actually quite pleasant, funnily enough. More towns in the area, Abbiategrasso, but again, very, very high density urbanism, which is maybe not appropriate to a small neighborhood, which I'm building in the middle of a set of tower blocks. So the dilemma was really to try and create traditional sort of urbanism, but that would cohabit for at least several years with a very hostile surrounding environment. So I looked towards towns which had more open spaces in them, such as market towns like Padua, which is a sequence of squares and buildings, and other market towns like Mantua, which again sequences of spaces and blocks and streets and spaces and blocks. A lot of open space, which is actually public and creates a very interesting sequence of a progression of rooms through a space. These are some of the pictures of Mantua on the ground. So these are the first studies that I had of the urban plans. So basically sequences, as I mentioned, of open space, blocks, open space, and each block is basically a condominium with private green space behind it, trying to maintain a sort of middle way between very high density and urban design, which remains open and allows the green space around it to come into the site. Because the only positive aspect of Rozzano at present really is the amount of greenery, because it's built in a green belt. It's on a low density, high rise model. So there is, a certain amount of parkland which you don't want to block out. These are very just preliminary roof plan studies and block diagrams of sort of volumetric study of the environment. This is the south block, which is even more explicitly kind of checkerboard pattern, similar to Padua, where you have piazzas, open spaces on the corners, on the outside, bringing you in, and then behind those blocks you have further piazzas, and then that leads you out towards the countryside at the back. So the purpose of the urban design really is to invite people into the space and make it interesting and engaging for them. And both of these schemes have mixed use commercial and residential buildings in them. I was able to finally persuade the town council that neighborhood retail would actually be a good idea if it was well designed. Again, you have a simple roof plan, underground parking, and a block diagram. More about the underground parking later. These are the final plans. In the meantime, there's all these are actually fully studied architectural designs, and I will go into that very, very shortly. These are very, very simple schematic plans showing how many units can be obtained on each floor. Probably when it actually does go to development in the following years, the developer will want to have more units, so it will probably be modified to some extent, but it is presently satisfactory, and it has a higher density than would normally be allowed in this area. But because we're working with the town, because I'm working directly with the town, we can actually decide and make the rules ourselves, which is a very great privilege. Here's a study of actually the underground parking. We have this problem even in Italy, where you do have to deal with parking minimums. But fortunately, all the residents' parking can fit underneath the building. They are not actually dug underground to any great extent, because this land to the south of Milan is very marshy. You just dig 2 feet underground and you have water. But the level of the land is actually lower than the level of the road. So the road is raised up from the land, and by raising the level of the actual development slightly further, you go up a slope from the existing road into the development, and you create that just that sufficient interstitial space to put a parking garage underneath the buildings. And as I'll show you at the end, the what look like basement windows of the buildings are actually just ventilation for the underground parking. In this particular instance, the existing road, Viale Campania, was a dead-end road with a school at the end. And I managed to persuade the town that we could build a road around the school to avoid it having that cul-de-sac dead-end effect. So that brings us into the problem with the architecture. And have I really talked for, how long have I talked for, Georgia? Okay, I can't hear you, but anyway, I will try and speed up. The problem with the architecture of Rozzano, this is, there's very, very little historic architecture to look to. It has a castle. It was a rural town with this castle. Some of the castle buildings have been converted into a library. Some of them are apartments. There's another farm that you saw in the first photograph of the old town of Rozzano, which has again been converted into a library. It seems to be very popular to convert big farms in towns to libraries, but you can only have so many libraries. The old town hall, very simple. This is as close as you can get to vernacular architecture in the rural area south of Milan. Very dignified. This is a silk factory along the side of the canal, a disused silk factory. Very, very simple industrial architecture. This is housing for workers in the silk factory on the canal. Not exactly the most engaging sort of architecture if you're trying to create a commercial development, because these developments will be commercial developments. They go to tender, and the developers that build them have to build the design that I've created with a set of very stringent rules that we're drawing up together. This is again farm workers housing in the town of Rozzano. That's the extent of the interesting historic architecture of the town of Rozzano. So what I did was I looked at the mechanisms which create vernacular architecture, and the model I used for this was the country I came from, because I know it quite well and I've studied it a long time in the past. This is that country. It's called Bermuda. It's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was an extinct volcano, and it has beautiful beaches, and it was colonized by people who shipwrecked on it, and actually survived to tell the tale and go and live on the island. And this same shipwreck in the early 1600s actually inspired Shakespeare's Tempest. It was which is Shakespeare's last play, of course. The people that traveled to Bermuda were actually on their way to Jamestown, Virginia, Puritans escaping the oppression in England. And the people that first came to Bermuda came from a very small area of the southwest of England, between Dorset and Somerset. So this was the architecture that they knew. So Bermuda is a very small country, very small island, with very specific conditions and very specific origin of the people that came there in the first place. So a very good case study of how vernacular architecture is created. So we have in the southwest of Dorset, this cob architecture, basically mud buildings with thatched roofs. Corfe Castle is a stone-built town with stone roofs. Hamoon Manor, again in Dorset, is a more upscale building. So these are all things that the people that settled in Bermuda saw and knew. And there are many aspects of vernacular architecture which created a very distinctive kind of architecture. So here you have a porch with what you call a Dutch gable, scalloped gable on the roof, on the top, a sort of neoclassical engaged ionic portal. So people building very, very simple cottages took elements from more monumental, more upscale buildings to give themselves something to aspire to. People building their house don't want to feel like they're doing something too humble. They want to do something which is making them feel feel good. So they use these elements to aspire to, like people do with fashion today. You know, fashion is selling people a dream, and architecture is the same thing. Another building which they would have seen, or some people would have seen, maybe some of the leaders of the group, the first settlers in Bermuda, would have been something like Kew Palace, again, with its otherwise known as the Dutch house because of what are called Dutch gables. This is Montacute House in near Sherborne in Dorset, which is a local example which the people in Bermuda definitely would have seen. In the gallery of Sherborne House has what is called a tray ceiling. So the ceiling rises up into the roof, and this allows extra light to come into the room, and it allows hot air to rise to the ceiling and keep the room cool, which is very important in Bermuda. Another model that the Bermudians, the early Bermudians brought with them from the southwest of England, and specifically, were houses, two houses, to be honest, by a chap called Roger Pratt. Now, Roger Pratt was a gentleman architect who worked with Inigo Jones. He built 3, perhaps 4 houses. One of these was Coles Hill House, which was burnt down by the National Trust, sadly. And this is Coles Hill House before the National Trust got their hands on it. And what this is, as you can see, this is actually becomes the archetypal model for early colonial residential palaces in Virginia. You have the steep roof, you have the huge chimneys at the ends on the corners, you have the balustrade, flat roof on the top, and you have the lantern. Those elements move to Virginia, but elements that get stop off in Bermuda are things like the staircase that you see here. This is known as a welcoming arms staircase, which sweeps out as it goes down. And the big chimneys, of course, are a very important iconic element. So these were specific elements from very specific houses by specific architects that were taken to Bermuda. This is the plan of Coles Hill House, a very simple double pile with a central corridor, welcoming arms staircases both on the front and the back. And what you have in the parlor and these rooms on the corners, either side of the fireplace, you have what are called powder rooms. Powder rooms would have been where people would have gone, and even now, the Americans give the name powder rooms to WCs. So they would basically have had the same purpose originally. It would theoretically have been powdering. A lady says they're going to powder their nose, they go to the bathroom. So those would have been either side of the staircase, of the sort of the fireplace. So what you have here then is the result of that, one of the results of that. Very, very simple cottage architecture made out of local materials. The first buildings in Bermuda were made out of pine and cedar wood, because the whole country, the whole island was covered with trees. It was a forest, but it also has 100% humidity all year round, salt air, and hurricanes. So wooden architecture lasts roughly an average of 6 months. They found that you could literally cut stone out of the ground, because this is coral limestone, volcanic coral limestone. It's very soft. You can't get much detail out of it. So the sort of extent of the decorative detail you can get out of it is a scalloped gable like this on the porch with this staircase. This one is not quite so splayed, but many of them are splayed. And you have big chimneys on the ends. This architecture it's a mixture of the culture the people are coming from, the materials they are using, and very specific climatic conditions. There is no fresh water on the island to any extent, so the roofs of the houses, even today, are to collect water collecting devices. You collect your own fresh water on the roof, and it goes into a cistern. And the cistern, in most cases, is the hole that you've dug to build your house in the first place. It's the quarry. That's the quarry you've created. This is Churchill House, which has a very distinct welcoming arms staircase. You have the cistern on the right. You have this stepped stone roof, which is whitewashed because it has to be whitewashed every 2 years for health purposes. And that collects the water, which goes directly into that system. So this is our Tucker's house in St. George's. St. George's is a World Heritage Site, where you have the fireplace, and you have the powder rooms left and right, and you have the tray ceiling. So these are all elements I've just shown you, which these all become the signature and endemic elements throughout Bermudian architecture for centuries to come. Another example I'm studying at the moment, which I'm just going to touch on very briefly, is a neighborhood south of Rome called the Garbatella. It's a social housing neighborhood built in the early 1900s to house workers. Originally to house workers, it was eventually used to house people who were displaced when Mussolini demolished the houses above the Forum and excavated the Forum. People who lived there were moved out of the city to a place called the Garbatella. And the architecture of the Garbatella was created by a group of architects in the early 1900s who literally did create a new style of vernacular architecture, which they called Barocchetto Romano. A lot of the elements of that came from medieval architecture around Rome in places such as Viterbo. This is Piazza San Pellegrino in the San Pellegrino medieval quarter of Viterbo, which I'll just show you a few pictures of. If you see black and white pictures, most of them are mine. I wouldn't say all of them are mine, but the vast majority are. This is a very, very beautiful medieval quarter. And the architects Sabatini and company, Piacentini and others created this sort of there are many, many influences that they used to create this architecture. Viterbo was only one of the many, but very distinctive, low cost, very rapidly built social housing. And this is the proof that you don't need to, if you're building good architecture, you don't need to plow money into it. You don't need to have expensive landscaping, expensive maintenance. The quality of the architecture will actually maintain the environment of a certain quality. You can say, if you visit the Garbatella district, you can tell that it's a poor neighborhood, but the people of the town have a huge sense of pride in their place and really do identify with the place. So with an architecture specific to that place that becomes identifying of that place, you can really create a sense of belonging, which you don't create in the dystopic Soviet suburbs of Rozzano. This is more Garbatella. So back to Rozzano. I had to look further abroad from the town itself because there wasn't enough material. This is a neighboring town called Corsico, so very similar sort of low-key vernacular urban architecture and rural architecture in the surrounding countryside. This is a farm manager's house in a town to the east with a very nice portico, very simple. And what I'm looking for is examples of simple architecture, which is characteristic, that can be used to create an identity and give a sense of place to a place. The architecture of the buildings that will be built in these two neighborhoods will be to a great extent low cost. And this is something that with Piercarlo Bontempi, we have quite a lot of experience doing. The architecture we do is not high-end resort architecture like Seaside or Alice Beach or many new urbanism towns of America, which are, quite honestly, resort towns for rich people. They are towns for normal people with very, very affordable prices. This is a town further to the southwest of Milan called Pieve del Cairo. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a rural town, but it has its kind of naive vernacular classicism, which is extremely appealing. This is, by looking around, what I'm trying to do is accumulate a library of architecture, which I can use to apply to a new neighborhood in Rozzano. And it has to be varied. So this is only one part of it. This is the outside of a rural agricultural court in Pieve del Cairo. These are more agricultural, rural housing, semi-rural, semi-urban houses and buildings around the outside neighborhood. This is again further down the canal from Milan. And I'm starting to look at agricultural architecture, which is quite impressive. There's a variety of it. You have here in this farm, which is across the canal from Rozzano. You have the farm manager's house, which is this big U-shaped building, and you have the barns to the left and right, some of which have fallen down, some of which have been restored. Both of these elements, all of these elements can be used to create mixed-use residential architecture of character. The farms of northern Italy have their origin in the Roman domus, obviously. Not obviously, but I will explain why. Because the first farms that were created in northern Italy were monasteries. Because until the Middle Ages, the whole Po Valley was a swamp. The people that drained that swamp were the Benedictines and Cistercians, and they lived in monasteries, which were constructed in the middle of the countryside as large courtyard complexes, which are generally actually fortified for their own defense. This model of rural development then mutated and became farm. This is the very spectacular Certosa di Pavia, which is a Cistercian monastery and mausoleum to the Visconti. The northern Italian farm type is, extremely architecturally rich. This is a courtyard farm called the Corte dei Angeli, the Court of the Angels in Piacenza, and this is actually the film set of Bertolucci's Novecento, which is another film I suggest you watch if you can download it from archive.org. This is not, you don't have to pay for any of these things. I'm not selling you stuff. I'm just telling you places to get information from. This is what it looks like now. So I'll explain a little bit more about this in a minute. This is the Sforzesca, which is another huge noble farm. These are the first very large scale farms built in northern Italy to farm huge swathes, tens of thousands of acres of farmland at one time. These are a little bit further out of Milan to the southwest. There's a huge variety and richness of farm architecture, which I was drawn to as an additional library of architecture, which supplemented the very simple vernacular, semi-rural and semi-urban mixed use and residential architecture which you can find. As you can see, this is Vibaldone. This is a monastery farm, still is a monastery. Has very, very clear references to Roman architecture. You have here motifs that you can find in Roman cities such as Ostia Antica, where you have a shop front on the bottom and you have the shopkeeper's house on the top. In this case, you have a stable and you have a hay barn above it. The interesting thing about the architecture of the farm in northern Italy is the productive buildings are the buildings which get the most architectural attention, because they are actually creating wealth, and they are creating a lot of wealth. So the stables, the barns, the granaries are the buildings which are the most iconic and the most architecturally important. And generally, the typologies of these buildings is very, very similar to that of the Lombard basilica. So you have a nave and two side aisles, and this sort of shed roof, gable-ended roof at the end, very typical of Milanese medieval churches. This is you can very, very explicitly classical Roman-derived farm building along the canal to the west. Visconti, owned by the Visconti family, Cascina Guardia di Sopra. So again, you have this, it looks like the base level of a palazzo. This is literally the base level of a Renaissance palazzo by Raphael, which takes its influence from, again, Roman architecture of the insula, with the arch enclosing a lower story and an upper story with someone living in a very small quarters above it. In this case, again, you have stables underneath and hay barns above it. Some of the farms are still fortified. I mean, the fortified farms still exist. You have these gatehouses, symmetrical gatehouses to this farm with a moat between them. This is within the same farm. You have a 14th century late Romanesque, early Gothic church. And right next to it, you can see the cows eating their hay. This is a multi-family farm. The farms to the south of Milan are single owner. They are generally owned by very large, wealthy landowners who pay, who basically have a feudal system where the people working on the farm get to keep some of what they cultivate. And if it's a bad year, they don't get to eat anything. To the north of Italy, which is less fertile, the farms are subdivided into multi-family. So you have basically what is a huge condominium with single family dwellings in each of these arches. And across the courtyard, you have the cowshed and hay barn, and they would go out to a small plot of land and basically do subsistence farming. Again, this is to the south, large-scale single owner farm. The productive buildings, again, are the architecturally interesting ones. This is, believe it or not, a pigsty. And this is functional vernacular agricultural architecture. And it has all the aspects of vernacular architecture. It's functional because the central nave is where the farm worker walks down. And it has the clerestory windows above it to allow air to escape, so that he doesn't get asphyxiated by the smell of the pigs either side. This, then generates a basilica facade with a rose window and bifoil windows either side. So you really are exalting the architecture of a simple agricultural building, but you're exalting that because it is giving you wealth and it's bringing you money. This is another one. It's a typology. It's a specific typology which is repeated throughout the Lombard plains. This is inside the pigsty, so you have this central nave with an open raised roof in the middle, and more rural buildings attached to noble residences. These are just farm workers' houses. This is a multi-family condominium farm near Monza. This is a rural court of a noble villa near Varese to the north. So I'm looking as much as I can at many examples of simple architecture, but which is characteristic and identifiable and has a particular atmosphere and feel to it that you can build very simply, but create an environment with which people can feel at home in. This is again, this is farm workers' housing for a single owner farm. In this quite beautiful C-shaped building with a double height loggia, 3-4 stories of houses with a mountain roof at the top. This is another large scale farm to the north east of Milan. And this is later, this is 17th century, but you have monumental classical details attached to the source of the wealth. An architect that built the one farm which is most emblematic of this is Giulio Romano. So this is the Palazzo Te, of course, this is Giulio Romano's Porta Giulia outside of Mantua. Giulio Romano was the ducal architect. He was a military architect, and he was also an agricultural architect. This is the Gonzaga family's farm north of Mantua called the Spinosa. The gatehouse of the farm, which you can see here, was built by Luca Fancelli, who was Giulio Romano's predecessor as the ducal architect. You had Alberti first, then you had Luca Fancelli, then you had Giulio Romano, and then Giulio Romano was succeeded by Bertani. So this farm existed, and Giulio Romano develops it further. It's a huge scale rice farm because the Gonzaga family actually maintained its wealth by being farmers and cultivating the land, and they supplied rice to the Republic of Venice. So what you see here, this is a stable block with a hay barn above it. You don't need me to tell you where all the motifs and influences come from. But what you have here is what I would describe as mercantile classicism. It's the classical architecture that you have in military architecture. You have it in industrial architecture up to the 19th century. And Giulio Romano uses it in agricultural architecture. And very interesting fun fact, this building here, this is the granary. It's a loggia underneath and the granary above it. It's a volume that Giulio Romano built to connect the farm manager's house on the right and the chapel on the left. And the pediment at the top of this granary is original. And this was built in the 1530s. So as we know, this is way before Palladio puts pediments on the tops of secular buildings. The generally recognized first instance of a pediment on a non-religious building is San Gallo's Poggio Acaiano for the Medici outside Florence, but that's a small porch attached to the front of a building. The first example of a pediment which actually breaks out of the top of the building is this, and it's Giulio Romano's farm, the Spinosa, for the ducal family of Mantua in the 1530s. This is the rice warehouse where all the rice would have been collected, and then it was loaded onto barges on these canals. The farm is surrounded by moats, and the canals lead directly down into the River Po, and from there to Venice directly by water to supply Venice with their main staple food. The building next to it is called the House of the Camparo. The origin of the brand Campari is a plural of Camparo. The Camparo is literally the man of the fields, but what the man of the fields actually does, in actual fact, is regulate the water supply. He regulates the irrigation supply and the canal mechanisms. So he's actually after the farm manager, he is the most important person in a large-scale industrial northern Italian farm because he makes it work or not work. This farm is now, it is still a single owner agricultural farm, working farm, but it's no longer a rice farm, it's now a cattle farm. And it's Italy's largest cattle farm. It has 1,200 cows in a shed, which is fortunately positioned way away from the main historical nucleus of the farm. But thankfully, as a result of that industrial size of the farm owned by one family, they are able to maintain and perpetuate the buildings of this incredible structure. So, I mean, Giulio Romano starts using what I call very impressive, severe mercantile classicism in agricultural buildings. And we know, of course, that Palladio was Giulio Romano's collaborator and continues that tradition with the Barchessa, the agricultural portion of his villas. Most of Palladio's villas on the mainland were nothing more than farms, and they had farm buildings with them, and they were all coordinated and designed. And the farm buildings of Palladio's villas are, to my mind, some of the most interesting parts. This is the stable block of the Villa Rotunda, which is down the hill from the Villa Rotunda. It's not attached to it like most of his. This is someone else's farm building. This is actually the guest wing of the Villa Valmarana Ainani, across the road from Palladio's Villa Rotunda. So again, sort of mercantile, classical, rural architecture, which is extremely stimulating. This is actually the stable of Villa Valmarana Ainani, which is a little temple, as you can see. The idea of exalting we'll just go back to Giulio Romano's granary. I mean, the idea of building a granary as a temple makes perfect sense. I mean, to Giulio Romano, to the Gonzagas at the time, because that really is a source of immense wealth, and so it is almost worthy of worship. The Spinosa is a working farm, was always a working farm, but it was also a place that they actually used to entertain and hold receptions. There are accounts of cardinals visiting it, so it was more than just a farm. So the northern Italians in the Po Valley, with Giulio Romano, the Gonzagas, Palladio, the Visconti family, the Sforza family, all these huge landowners were the pioneers of large-scale industrial farming, and that was studied by the English. The English came to Italy for the Grand Tour, but they not only studied Roman architecture and classical architecture, but they also studied Italian techniques of large-scale farming and the architecture that was attached to those techniques. And people such as John Plaw here went back to England and wrote treatises on ideal farm architecture, which was a direct result of what they'd seen in northern Italy. So I'm using my understanding and discovery of northern Italian rural architecture in a very similar way to the way that the English architects did in the 17th and 18th centuries. These are some of the plates from John Plaw's treatise. He wasn't the only one. This is the farm attached to Holcombe Hall. Holcombe Hall, of course, as you know, was designed by William Kent. The farm next to Holcombe Hall was designed by Sam Wyatt, who was James Wyatt, Wyatt's younger brother. So the Wyatts, the Kents, all of a kind of similar architectural genealogy. Holcombe Hall's farm is still one of England's largest scale farms. It's 10,000 acres and it's still a working farm. So you have in the first modern large-scale farms of England were brought back by people like Robert Adam. This is again Holcombe Hall's farm. Robert Adam, William Kent. This is Robert Adams' farm in Scotland called Colzine, just south of Glasgow on the coast. This is a picture of it from the air. Robert Adam came to Italy, studied farm architecture of northern Italy, large-scale farming, and went back to England and not only designed beautiful stately homes and terraced houses in London, but agricultural buildings. This is more of Colzine Castle, and you can see this is designed by Robert Adam, but it's distinctly becomes a kind of vernacular of its own in the agricultural type. This is a stable block of Badminton House. The architect of this is not known to me, but I will find out. And this is William Kent in Rousham. This is his cowshed. It's a kind of almost romantic sort of agricultural folly. Another famous example of treatises of farm buildings and agricultural architecture was James Gandy, who wrote two volumes, published 2 volumes, of which I have copies somewhere, The Rural Architect. And John Soane himself also dabbled in much more humble manor house architecture. So where you have John Soane's architecture, but it's simplified and it's more severe and almost more close to what I would describe as the Italian mercantile classicism in an English manner. So going back to Italy, this happens also in the 18th century. These are buildings, the buildings I will show you now are all buildings in the Royal Park of Monza. The Royal Park of Monza was built for the Austrian emperors. And the architect of these buildings was Luigi Canonica, who was a collaborator of Pier Marini. Pier Marini is the architect of La Scala, so classical architecture genealogy. This is farm workers' housing in very simplified kind of Palladian classical manner, where you strip down the detail but keep the dignity. This is a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more in the manner of Ledoux. This is a mill. This is a pheasant house. This is now an expensive restaurant. This is a stable, farmhouse and stable. It's a double ownership, semi-detached, we call it, I would say, but very using materials and motifs in a very, very original and appropriate manner for the typology. So I am studying these things and learning from them as much as possible. Pure neoclassical farm architecture, still by Luigi Canonica, but mixture of kind of rough cut flint stone, finely carved stone on the corners, stucco, brick. Very, very interesting. This is again Luigi Canonica, but this is the stable block of Villa Greppi. I don't need to give you the examples of where these come from again. Very similar to the mercantile classical agricultural architecture around Milan. More of the same. So this is all material which I have basically kind of distilled in my mind and used to work with in the architecture of these small model pilot neighborhoods of Rozzano. These are the final roof plan drawings, which I showed you earlier. And these are some first sketches that I did of what the architecture would actually look like on the ground. So you have a mixture of simple sort of rural urbanism, rural vernacular urbanism, and a kind of residential palazzo in the back, which is taking its precedent really from agricultural architecture of a classical origin. This is the square of the other side, which is facing the road. So you have an opening, you have two kind of mirrored buildings with a portico underneath them, more elaborate architecture on the more urban road side. And as you go through the site, you have a canted neoclassical rural villa inside there. And then as you walk through the sites, they gradually become more and more rural and agricultural as you go towards the countryside. So this is another courtyard with a watering pond in the center of it, two not exactly symmetrical but complementary sort of C-shaped buildings either side of this courtyard with their own private gardens facing the courtyard. You can see I literally lifted Canonica's kind of Palladian Serliana neoclassical portico from his farm dwelling there, with a bit of rusticated fortified gatehouse in between these two buildings on the other side with a loggia on the top of it. So as I move through the other side, I'm taking more rural elements and making them into something which is very, very specifically of its place and very, very specifically Lombard. For those that know the area well, architects that know the area well, you can definitely identify this architecture as Lombard rather than as Veneto or other areas of Italy. But it's simple and it's easy to build actually without actually spending more than you would doing a low-cost housing development. This is a passageway from a secondary piazza courtyard towards the park on the other side, using almost kind of naive classicism of agricultural architecture. Here's some more finished definitive drawings of the site on the north. As you can see here, you can just tell that on the left-hand side you have the road. The ground is sloping gradually down to the countryside, and as you move to the right, you see these openings in the basements of the buildings, which are actually garage ventilation, and you have doorways, escape, emergency exits directly from the garage, or even just direct access from the garage to the countryside. And these the gate on the left here and this little door on the right are actually direct access from the private courtyards of the condominium buildings behind them to the countryside. So what I'm using the characteristic of agricultural architecture, which is very appealing and useful, is the fact that it has a lot of openings, it has a lot of loggias, and it has a lot of porticos, which you can translate and you can incorporate into buildings to make them more appealing, because people that are living in houses now whilst you know, the workers' housing of the silk factory on the canal is very beautiful and you know, has a great amount of dignity to it, there is very little open space. In these schemes, there is a lot of open space. Almost every apartment has access to open space, either on the roof terrace here, shared roof terrace, or on a loggia, on an enclosed balcony, and also being an area of the countryside which is, you know, insect infested and mosquito infested. By being inset porticos and loggias, you can actually protect them by screens if you have to. This is an interior cut through an interior street, so this is actually facing the road, so not so much in the way of open space, but the open space is really on the courtyards on the other side. This is another cut, central cut along through the center of the whole scheme. So you can sort of see on the right here is the more urban area. The architecture is, you know, moderately more urban, more elaborate, and then it becomes more vernacular. And then on the left, it becomes almost more agricultural as it moves towards the countryside. What's happening? I move this and I can't move that. Okay, this is the same section looking the other way. So as you move to the right-hand side, you're moving towards the countryside, and you arrive and you come out into what is a sort of a C-shaped piazza, which is raised above the parkland to the north. And so you're open towards the northern parkland. You have steps which go down directly onto that parkland and meet sort of pathways and bicycle paths that are created through the parkland. And as you can see, the architecture facing the parkland is directly derived from agricultural architecture, which I've shown examples to you just now. And this is the final picture of the whole development from the north. I apologize for that fact that I haven't filled them with people, but we hope that they would be more inhabited. The building on the left is a reinterpretation of farm workers' housing, and with open loggias. Most of the apartments have access to an open loggia on one side or the other side. And on the right-hand side, you have a much more rural courtyard with these multi-story opened arches looking onto the private garden. I've sort of gone through what I've looked at, the mechanisms I've studied of how vernacular architecture works, and then examples of what I've looked at. What I've done is I've tried to do a little bit what the early Bermudian settlers did, take elements of architecture which appeal to me and use them to create simple, affordable architecture, but which is architecture that provides something that people can aspire to. And there is, we do know there is a very, very great market for this. There is a great market for dystopic modernist architecture. Some people like it, but there is an equally great market for traditional and humane architecture and urbanism. So I'm confident that if we manage to create this and complete it as intended, it will be very, very successful. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
I've talked for
extremely
a long time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think you managed to cram 2 talks in one.
Probably.
That one with agricultural architecture was extremely interesting. So if you have now questions, the participants, you are invited to unmute your microphone, start having image, microphone and camera, please unmute them and ask if you have questions, please. Jan, do you have a question?
Mm-hmm.
I do have a question. I mean, I'm interested to know what the legislative framework is for urban development in Italy, because the images that you've shown are very beautiful places, but I don't think you could build anything like that in the UK. because housing is designed essentially by the highways department, who mandate various rules about rubbish collection and all the rest of it. So by the time you've been through the grind and all that, they all look the same, because it's throughout the whole country. Our suburban developments are designed by highway engineers, because their one differs to them. It has to work for highways, it has to work for bin lorries and the rest of it. How do you square that up in Italy? There must be a similar problem somewhere.
This is a very sore point. It's a great pleasure to see Jan Matag here. I think we may have met a long time ago, but it's very wonderful to see you, and thank you for the question. It is a sore point, and I mean, like in England, in America, for instance, I would say almost 100% of the urban problems of America are purely legislative. I mean, it is legally obliged that you build that way, and your roads are such a width, and your houses are single family only, and they're a certain distance apart, and you can't have shops anywhere near them, and all this sort of thing. So it's a tricky question. With the town of Rozzano, I'm working directly with the planners of the town. So I have a certain degree of freedom, which I wouldn't have if this was a private development. I would say, I'll just backtrack a little bit. To my knowledge, I don't think the situation is quite so drastic in England as you paint it. I think there have been examples of people who have been successful. One I would, to my mind, seems to be quite successful, and this is Hugh Petter of Adam Architecture, in that he's been able to create a kind of trust mechanism with the local authorities, where they give him much more free rein to legislate himself this kind of planning when he's designing new towns such as Newquay and Mansledan. So I think the key is really, that is the key, and it's pretty much what is happening here in Rozzano. I'm working very close with the town planners. The politicians are obviously the instigators of this, but the more important people who really appreciate what is being done and understand what I'm doing are the planners themselves, because the planners aren't elected; they continue, and they are the people that actually materially make the town function. Now, I do come up against things. I mean, the whole scheme, I have had the freedom to decide the density I want and the height of buildings I want. The density of these schemes, although they're not high density like a medieval town, they are the volume of building which is being built on these is significantly higher than would be normally allowed. So this is a selling point to the private developers who this land will be sold to. They will be allowed to build greater volume of housing than they would be otherwise allowed. But I do have to come up against things, as I mentioned, like parking minimums. You have to have a certain number of parking spaces for the private residents. For each square cubic meter of residence that you build, you have to have a certain amount of public parking. So I created new street around part of the site in this case, but that new street is also served to be filled with parking, which I would prefer not to have to do, but these are realities which have to be dealt with.
Can I ask you a detailed question?
Yeah.
With basically, you've got a sort of raised area with the parking underneath. How do you? It sounds like a very prosaic thing, but how do you deal with rubbish disposal?
Right. Well, rubbish disposal in Italy, generally you'd have a condominium. In the area of the parking garage, you generally have a room with all the sort of wheelie bins in it, and the condominium inhabitants go and put their rubbish down in that, and then you have a janitor who comes once a week, takes the wheelie bin out and puts it on the street when it's due to be collected.
Right.
So I mean,
yeah, no,
it depends on.
That would be difficult to pull off in the UK, because the
right.
the government collects collects the waste, and so they will not go onto private land.
Right.
It has to be roads have to be built according to the local authority highways department standards. And it's the usual thing with swept curves and 8 meters wide and lighting and all the rest of it.
Exactly.
And it's very difficult to build that. Designing it is one thing, but actually getting it through the process, and I presume you have to defend it all the way through when you get to the point where you have to build it, because there'll be the usual grinding it down to, well, we found an easier way of doing it.
Of course, yeah. It's a struggle. Everything is a struggle, and nothing is easy.
Yeah.
But
okay, well done. It's looking beautiful.
Well, thank you. Well, I hope it will look beautiful in reality. As you say, you're muted, Georgia.
We have a question in the meeting chat from Bilson. And he's asking, how will you be dealing with the materiality in the notion of vernacular, noting opportunities in terms of sustainability and craftsmanship? This in contrast with the example you gave, like Blade Runner. So
right.
Practically the fabric of those buildings, how will you be dealing with them?
Well, the fabric of the buildings, the basic fabric is, unfortunately, we have a constraint there as well because of our anti-seismic, anti-earthquake laws. Up until a few years ago, all of our buildings were load-bearing masonry construction. Now you have to have a concrete frame, which is infilled with masonry. The only reason why you have to have a concrete frame is because the engineers who've gone to university and the architects who've gone to university only know how to calculate the earthquake resistance of a concrete frame. Load-bearing masonry can be perfectly earthquake resistant, but the engineers and architects who come out of school in Italy don't learn how to do it. And as they are then the people that legislate it and create the laws, they make it legally, you're legally obliged to create a concrete frame and then infill it. But I mean, most of this, so we do have to deal with concrete frame construction, but then we're infilling it with terracotta bricks, hollow terracotta bricks to the most part, and then lime mortar rendering. So the basic wall construction is fairly prosaic, nothing special. The roof materials, the floor materials, the paving, the exterior paving, the wood, the windows would be made of wood. All this sort of material is, as much as possible, coming from as local a source as possible. So terracotta roof tiles, local stone paving on the outside. So that, to answer the question, in terms of economic and sort of carbon sustainability of things being sourced as close by as possible. Craftsmanship, there is fair amount of possibility for craftsmanship in things like woodworking, ironworking, balustrades, railings, details. The most basic construction is mostly rendered masonry. Some of it is exposed brick, but with rendered masonry you can do a certain degree of molding and modeling, very cost-effective way. So as far as possible, local and sustainable and natural.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the public?
I do have another question.
That's very good.
I mean, Jonathan and I have been around this game for quite a while now, and when I was younger, I had this idea that if we built beautiful things, we would kind of convince people that this was the way to go. It doesn't seem to have worked. So here we are, I mean, you're producing a beautiful development, but there's, this is a drop in the ocean of the rubbish that's being built. do you ever see a point where people will actually acknowledge that there's been a mistake? Because it's decades and decades of the same argument, and we have decades and decades of the same argument talking to planners who always want something modern. They prefer something modern. Is there an end point to this, or will it take a complete civilizational collapse to achieve it?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, I think we are seeing traces of it. I mean, I wouldn't despair completely. I mean, it's still a battle. I mean, there is still a huge prevalence of people who promote, smart cities and modernity, and everything has to be new and progressive. But there to a certain extent, in Italy at least, where we have built, small traditional neighborhoods and new developments, there has been a reaction to that, and people have seen it and discovered that it is possible and it is actually successful. So I mean, the Rozzano is like kind of the second generation or third generation of that, where a local authority has come to us and said, we've seen what you've done, we like it, we want you to do the same kind of thing here. And really, it is the important people to talk to are the planners. And one of my, I'd say, missions is to engage with these people, to engage with modernists, and as much as possible to engage with the local authorities and planners, the people on the ground who are actually legislating, and make the argument to them. And if you do talk to them in a civilized, open manner, they can be receptive. Not all of them are, some of them aren't, but you win some, but you lose some, but you also do win some at the same time. And I think it's fundamental. I think the only way you can really make a difference, in my opinion, is by working from the outside in. That's my kind of theory. You don't make a difference by building a beautiful opera house or a beautiful neoclassical theater or courthouse in the city, which is fantastic. I mean, I love them. Or to be honest, a mansion for a rich client is wonderful, but it's not going to change the world. The way you can actually make a difference is by going in the rural edge of the city, where there's less urban fabric to start with, and what you do build can have can weigh the balance more. Whereas in the center of a city or in a more built up suburban area, it's really getting lost. So if you start on the edge and sort of nibble away at it, and that's what we're sort of trying to do. And it's a very long process. It's not going to happen overnight. But people do realize that, especially in the periphery of towns, where you have these places which are just places for people to sleep and then go to work from, they're not places to live. You can actually create places to live, and people will begin to realize that. So I mean, I think we don't need to we shouldn't despair. It is depressing sometimes to look at what happens, but we have to continue.
So practically, you believe in the power of the vernacular, like a secondary architecture, to push things a bit, without being needed some fantastic star buildings.
Exactly, because of what really makes our environment so soul destroying is just that soup of mediocre architecture. That just bad urban design and architecture, and just unplanned space, or legislatively planned space to respect the parameters that Jan is talking about. So if you can provide a decent alternative to that, you can really start to make it's not, you're not going to change the world overnight, but you have to do it in small steps, and not all in one place. It happens all across Europe, gradually. But the key people to engage really are the planners and the administrators. So if you can bring them on board and show them what you can do and what is possible and how you can improve the environment of their town, by doing something which is giving people something to that they identify with. Yeah, I mean, the traditional architecture is not just, you know, creating something which looks old. It's creating something which people are familiar with. You know, they recognize it. They understand it as a place to live, not just a place to sleep and drive their car from.
That's very true. Any other questions from the public? I was thinking that maybe that failure of modern materials, which now practically we are in a dead line of concrete, maybe this will trigger a bit also this change, if we are able by then to show them that there is an alternative.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an example of, you know, the result of that happening, which is directly.
Jaya?
Hi, Jonathan. I just a quick question was whether there was any attempt or a thought about including, you know, a little commercial space, a shop or a community-based unit as part of this development, which might be interesting to make it more sustainable and so on for a longer period. But also I want to thank you for actually a wonderful talk and for all this, you know, collaborating with the planners, which I believe, I mean, I work in London and I believe that even on a very small scale of where I work, that helps build trust, build relationships, and so we can get a little bit more done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jaya. It's great to see you. I did make a little bit of a mention of that. I think it may not have been clear enough, but I can just go back very quickly. Yes, I had one of my battles with the planners was to introduce mixed use commercial space, because as I mentioned, they said, no, we've had you know, neighborhood retail in the past and it hasn't worked, but you know, obviously because it was just so horrible. But it's not. I have kind of, you can see on this side here, and says coming from the urban part on the left into the first sort of piazza. This building here has this space on the ground here, which is, I've kind of left it flexible. It could be a commercial space. There are possibilities for commercial space throughout this in the first courtyard on the left. On the other side, there are possibilities for commercial space both in this building here and on this building here, which is on the end of the piazza. And even when we get into the end of this whole complex in this sort of square overlooking the countryside, there is some, you know, possible, you know, cafe commercial space here on there. And that I haven't actually drawn it. It's all been drawn with shutters closed, of course, but it is built in. The possibility to do that, to add that in here is built into it. This is within the center of the street, so there's nothing there. But if we look, just going forward again, on the other scheme, of course, you have this the piazzas, the spaces which are open towards the public, have, you know, commercial space underneath them. So you are, because you do need that. I mean, you're right. You cannot build. Just purely residential is not what you want. It doesn't. We've seen it doesn't work. You know, separating the residential from the commercial from the office doesn't work. If you do that in the daytime, the place becomes dead, and in the nighttime, people just close themselves in their apartments. If you have an environment where a neighborhood space, you know, a bakery or greengrocer or a newsagent, just simple things that serve the neighborhood, that people will come to, that will make that work, you know, 24, you know, all day round. So
absolutely, and it's lovely that you've actually expressed that in the architecture. So it's, now that you've pointed it out, it's very clear to see. Thank you.
It hasn't been filled. I haven't filled it with people walking. You generally in these, especially if a modernist does a scheme, he fills his scheme with happy families going shopping and things like that.
Correct.
So I probably should have done, but I'm very aesthetic in that.
It's very expressive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public, or we can wrap it? So, other questions? Howard?
Yes, I'm curious as to how the entrances are not very clear, and I was interested in your pictures of the communal farmhouses. Do they have internal staircases, or are they like access balconies, or how does all that work in your scheme?
Well, in my scheme, it is. I mean, there is generally a central staircase distributing apartments on each floor, and maybe more than one entrance and staircase in each of these blocks, so divided into various buildings. So you have here, you have an entrance there, you have an entrance on the corner there. It's all. I mean, if I have to go way back to the beginning to the plans. Take a while. On the way there, if you look at the communal farm buildings generally have one staircase. This is all open, and then this balcony here is open, and the individual living quarters go straight off a communal balcony. It's not something you can really propose nowadays. Each person wants their own balcony, so the distribution inside my buildings is not quite a copy of farm residences. It's more modern apartment building, or Italian apartment building with central staircases with maybe 2-4 apartments on each floor. These are trying to find you a residential building. They're not. This one here, for instance, here you'd have you have one opening there with a staircase, and then it would have a corridor up on the upper floor, and then off the corridor you'd have individual living quarters. This is for farm. These are not owner farmers. These are almost feudal serfs of the farm of the landowner. Bertolucci's Novecento actually explains that whole system and how it changes with the end of the Second World War. Up until the Second World War, northern Italy is practically a feudal system where the farmers are the people working on the farm. They are allowed to keep some of the produce, but they don't get paid. Their payment is to keep some of the produce. So if there's a drought that year and they don't have any produce, they die. So that's. But going back to the plan, these are the more urban buildings. These are actually large sort of palazzo buildings with this is actually a single ownership, large townhouse. These are slightly more modern than the average farm worker's house. You have 1, 2, 3 entrances on this, and then you have a staircase on each entrance, and then maybe 2 or 4 apartments on each staircase. That's the more similar kind of distribution system to what I've actually got in my project now. This is a single family manager's house. The buildings in the Garbatella, they generally have a central staircase here with 2 or 4 apartments on each landing again. Medieval buildings are a case apart, of course. So going back to the factory, the silk factory workers' houses have balconies on the back. So they have one or 2 staircases either end, and then the living quarters go straight off a communal balcony. Again, it's not a typology you can really repropose in the present day.
Understood.
So here we are. This is just a very, very simple hypothesis for how each of these buildings is divided up. So you have an entrance. It shows where some of them have single entrance into a communal courtyard, and then from there you go into these secondary entrances with staircases and elevators. So you have a block with 3 stairwells, and from each of those stairwells you have between 3 on this one here, 4 on this one here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apartments on this one. I mean, between 2, 3, 4, 5 apartments per stairwell. So that's pretty much how that's distributed. That's just a proposal. It could change. This building here, for instance, has what is called an altana, which is a sort of lantern light volume, which brings light down the stairwell. This one has a central passageway, and the entrance and stairwell is off the side of that, which is quite typical of Italian apartment buildings. And these ones, you go through a central passageway into the garden, left and right, into the separate stairwells. So again, quite typical. This one, yeah, had an entrance on the ground floor, which could be a semi-commercial space, but on the upper floors it has a single staircase serving 1, 2, 3, 4 apartments on that side, 3 apartments on this side. So I mean, that's the sort of distribution and access system you have. Again, this is the same thing on the other side.
No, thank you. I'm very taken with the way that you've kind of discovered the architecture for it. I think that's fascinating. Well, the whole thing's fascinating and great scheme. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's very challenging. It was a very challenging and rewarding process so far. You're muted, Georgia.
Any other questions? If nobody has anything else to ask, I would like to thank you all for your presence this evening and to let you know that our next talk will be on 2nd of November, and we will have Timothy Smith and Jonathan Taylor with a very interesting topic, Losing Streak, the Competition and Architectural Exploration. So I'm waiting for all to come back. Thank you very much for staying with us so long, and I wish you a very nice evening then.
Thank you very much indeed, Georgia. Thank you,
and of
everyone.
course, thank you very much, Jonathan, for such a fantastic talk.
You're so kind. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
All the best to
Good
everyone.
evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there are 3 new messages. No, it's just thank you.
Thank you. Carolina, thank you very much indeed. Okay. Bye.